In the heart of a city that never seemed to rest, where neon lights flickered over cracked sidewalks and busy people rushed past the forgotten, there walked a boy with silent steps and a heavy heart. His name was Tafari, a 12-year-old orphan. With skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that carried more sorrow than a child should bear. He had no family, no roof, no bed, only the old oversized hoodie he found in a thrift bin, and a pocket that held exactly one crumpled dollar. Tafari had wandered the streets all day, hoping for a kind stranger or a leftover piece of bread behind a diner, but the city had no mercy. It turned cold as the sun dipped behind high buildings. The chill crept under his sleeves, and his stomach growled with a hunger that had become all too familiar. He passed a bakery, its warm glow spilling onto the sidewalk, but he walked on. That dollar had to last until when, he didn't know. Then, just past a bus stop where no one waited, Tafari saw him. An old man sat against the stone wall of a grand towering building. His clothes were ragged, his hands trembling in the cold. His face was worn by time, marked with sorrow and silence. Most people passed him without a glance. But Tafari stopped. He stared at the man and saw something in his stillness, a sadness that mirrored his own. Tafari's stomach twisted in pain, but not just from hunger. He looked down at the dollar in his hand. It was all he had. Yet somehow it felt too much to keep for himself when someone else looked even hungrier. Without hesitation, he turned and crossed the street to a tiny corner store. He bought a small loaf of bread, the cheapest he could find. The cashier barely noticed him. Outside, he returned to the man and placed the bread gently beside him. The man looked up, but Tafari was already walking away, heart pounding from the cold and the strange warmth that came from giving. He didn't know who the man was. He didn't ask. He didn't expect anything, but the old man watched him, eyes following his small figure as he disappeared into the night. Behind the worn face and ragged coat was a hidden truth, one that would change Tafari's life forever, because the building the boy had walked past, so tall, so clean, so out of reach, belonged to that man. And for the first time in years, the owner of the building felt something stir in his chest, something he thought he had lost. Morning broke over the city like a pale whisper. Gray skies loomed above steel towers, and puddles shimmered in the gutter where no child should ever have to walk barefoot. But Tafari did. He had slept behind a rusted dumpster the night before, using his arms to shield himself from the bitter wind. The scent of gasoline and rot clung to his clothes, but he rose with the kind of quiet strength only the deeply wounded carry. He had no food, no money, and no destination. Yet his feet moved with purpose, as though guided by a will stronger than hunger. Tafari had learned to survive on almost nothing: crumbs from the back of bakeries, half-eaten fruit dropped at the market, or the mercy of strangers too busy to care. But something about last night lingered inside him, that man, that moment, that bread. He didn't regret it. Not for a second. Meanwhile, inside that towering building of polished stone and spotless windows, the man Tafari had fed sat in a darkened office that once sparkled with pride and power. No one had seen him enter, and none dared question his presence. His name had once echoed through halls of business and finance. He had built the building, floor by floor, from a dream forged in suffering. But wealth had not softened him, it had hardened him. Until years ago, when everything began to crumble, he had grown bitter, cold, alone. That night, hidden beneath rags, he had sat outside the very empire he created, not as a king, but as a ghost. He had watched people walk past him as if he were invisible, until a small boy with dark skin and empty pockets had done the unthinkable. He had given. The memory clawed at the man's chest. Who was this boy? Where did he come from? Why had he given his last possession to a stranger? The questions were louder than the silence he had grown used to. So he did something he had not done in years. He left the comfort of his empty office and walked He retraced the path the boy had taken. Past the same street lamp, the same puddles, the same flickering sign. He scanned alleyways and trash bins. His expensive shoes were now worn and dusty, his coat still the same one he had worn outside. He looked like a man from nowhere, but in his heart something stirred, a need, a memory. A flicker of hope. And miles away, Tafari sat on a cold bench, pulling his hoodie over his face to block the wind. He didn't know it yet, but his life was being followed not by misfortune, but by the very man he had saved without knowing. A man who owned more than just buildings. A man who held secrets that would soon unravel everything Tafari believed about himself. Tafari wandered aimlessly through the city streets, his small feet dragging through gravel and grit. His body ached from hunger, but his heart was strangely full. In a world that rarely looked his way, he had done something that mattered. He had chosen kindness over survival, and though the hunger gnawed harder now, his spirit held strong. He found himself at the edge of a construction site, where tall cranes loomed like iron giants and dust clouded the air. No one noticed him sitting behind a stack of old tires, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. He watched the workers from afar, men with strength in their hands and sweat on their brows. He longed to be like them one day, to have purpose, to build something that would last. Back near the city's heart, the old man moved with quiet urgency. His memory of Tafari's face grew clearer with each step. He had once been like that boy, young, poor, determined. But decades of success had buried that memory under gold and glass. Now, for reasons he couldn't explain, he needed to find the boy who had given him bread without a word. He asked around. He described the child in an old hoodie, with dark skin and kind eyes. Most shook their heads. One vendor pointed vaguely down an alley. A bus driver shrugged, but none knew Tafari's name. The boy was invisible to the world, just another shadow. Among many. Hours passed. The man, once powerful, once feared, found himself growing desperate. He walked until his legs burned, until the sun began to slip behind the buildings once again. His wealth couldn't buy him what he now wanted most, an answer. He stopped near the same bench where Tafari had sat the night before. He looked at the empty space, hoping for a sign. A broken button. A scrap of paper. But there was nothing. Then, across the street, he saw a flicker of movement. It was brief. Just a glimpse of a boy disappearing behind a food truck into the alleys beyond. But it was enough. The man stepped off the curb. He crossed the street with the urgency of a father chasing a memory, unaware that every step was drawing him closer, not only to Tafari, but to a truth buried long ago. Because Tafari's past was not just marked by loss, it was marked by abandonment, by a name once erased, by a family once shattered. And the man who now searched for him was no stranger to that wound. He had once left something behind. And fate was leading him straight back to it. The sun had set, and the city glowed with its artificial heart-fluorescent lights, neon signs, and 1,000 windows blinking like stars. Tafari curled up in a narrow alley between two dumpsters, his knees to his chest, his thin body trembling. In the cold, rats scurried nearby, and a siren echoed in the distance, but he was too tired to move, too hungry to cry. He stared at the cracked wall beside him, as if hoping it would open and offer him a door to another life. He had no name to call for comfort, no face to remember with warmth. The only thing he held on to was the small act of kindness he had given. It was nothing in the eyes of the world, but to him it was proof that he could still feel, still choose, still be more than what the streets had made of him. And not far away, a man moved through the night, guided by a force he could no longer ignore. His name had once been spoken with reverence in corporate boardrooms, but none of that mattered. Now, he was chasing a ghost, the memory of a child who had given without asking, who had shown him what all his fortune never could. He turned a corner and paused. The street was nearly empty, except for a boy in a corner, wrapped in shadows. It was him. Tafari. The man's heart pounded not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, recognition, a connection he hadn't fully understood. Until now. He approached slowly, afraid the boy would vanish like a dream. As he stepped closer, his eyes scanned the boy's face, the nose, the shape of the jaw, the quiet pain in his expression. They were all familiar, because once, many years ago, before success, before buildings and contracts and board meetings, he had held a child in his arms, a child he never named, a child he had walked away from, a choice that had haunted him in silence. Now, the boy lay asleep in the cold, unaware that the man who had abandoned him was standing just feet away, aching with regret, trembling with realization that he wanted to speak, to reach out. But guilt wrapped around his throat like a chain. And so, he simply knelt down and placed his own coat over Tafari's sleeping form. The thick, expensive fabric looked strange on such a small frame, but it was all he could offer. For now. As he stood back and watched Tafari stir beneath the warmth, one thought echoed in his heart. This child was not a stranger. This child was his own blood. And though the boy did not yet know it, the truth was about to rise like a storm. One that would shake everything. Morning light crept through the narrow alley, slicing across discarded cans and crumpled paper. Tafari stirred beneath a coat far too fine to belong in a place so forgotten. He blinked against the rising sun, confused by the warmth that wrapped around him like a shield. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming until he touched the heavy fabric and realized it was real. Someone had been here. Someone had covered him, but who? He rose slowly, the coat draped around his shoulders. It smelled faintly of leather, of distant wealth, of a world he had never known. His stomach tightened, not from hunger this time, but from a feeling he couldn't name. It was as though the city had whispered something in the night, a secret he had yet to understand. A few blocks away, the man who had once built empires stood at the edge of a park, watching children laugh and play. He was not among them. He stood apart, heavy with memories he had buried so deep they had nearly rotted inside him. He thought of the woman he had loved long ago, young, gentle, brave. She had given him a son he never held for more than a few moments. A son he had walked away from, convincing himself it was for the best. He chose ambition over family, and in the process he lost both. Now that same child, left behind in silence, had reappeared, unaware of who he truly was. Tafari wandered the city with the coat still wrapped around him. He passed people who glanced but didn't stop. He looked up at the tall buildings, the polished glass, the symbols of a life far beyond reach. Yet, unknowingly, he carried a piece of that world on his back. The man followed him from a distance, always watching, never close enough to be seen. He saw the boy pick up scraps, share a piece of bruised fruit with a stray dog, and offer his seat on a bench to an old woman. There was no bitterness in the boy, only quiet strength, and it broke the man's heart. How could someone so abandoned still choose to be good? He knew what he had to do, but guilt is not a door easily opened. His wealth, his buildings, his legacy, they were ashes in the face of this truth. He had left a child to survive alone, and that child had become something far more noble than he had ever been. But fate was no longer patient, and the shadows of yesterday were pushing their way into the light, because soon Tafari would find a letter, folded into the inside pocket of that expensive coat, a letter written by trembling hands, a letter that would reveal the name of the man he had unknowingly. And more than that, it would reveal the truth of who he truly was. The city was waking. Buses roared down the streets, horns pierced the air, and people rushed past one another with eyes glued to time. But Tafari walked slowly, as if the world moved in a different rhythm for him. He pulled the heavy coat closer, both for warmth and for comfort. It was the nicest thing he had ever touched, and yet, something about it made him feel uneasy. He didn't belong to fine things, not to silk linings or polished buttons. He belonged to corners and concrete, to silence and hunger. Still, he wore it, because someone, for a reason he didn't understand, had placed it on him. He found an old bench near a quiet fountain in the park and sat alone, letting the morning sun spill over his thin face. The coat hung loose around his arms, and that was when he felt it, a stiffness inside the inner pocket. He reached in slowly, his fingers brushing against folded paper. A letter. His heart pounded. He unfolded it carefully, like it might fall apart in his hands. The handwriting was crooked and uneven, as though it had been written by someone who had forgotten how to feel. The first line made his breath catch. To the boy who gave me bread when I was nothing. The words spilled across the page like confessions. They told of a man who once had everything, yet gave up the one thing that truly mattered. They told of a child born into silence, left behind in the name of success. They told of nights filled with regret and years spent hiding behind wealth that could never heal a broken heart. And then came the words that shattered. Tafari's world. You are my son. Time stopped. The paper trembled in his hands. The city around him faded. His breath grew shallow. For a moment, the only sound he heard was the echo of his own heartbeat. He read the letter again, and again. Each sentence sliced deeper. He thought of his mother, how she had never spoken of his father, how she had died too soon, leaving behind no answers. He had lived all his life thinking he was alone, unwanted, forgotten. But the man he had given bread to, the man with hollow eyes and trembling hands, was not a stranger. He was his father, and not just any man, but the owner of the very building Tafari had once stared at in awe. A man of fortune, a man of power, a man who had watched him from afar, unable to speak, too buried in shame. Tafari stood up, letter clutched in his hands, the wind tearing at the edges of the page. He turned and looked back toward the city skyline. Somewhere in those towers, the man who had given him this truth was waiting, not for forgiveness, not for a second chance, but for the courage to face the past. And Tafari, with pain in his chest and fire in his soul, began to walk toward the truth, toward the father he never knew, toward the reckoning that could break them both, or build something neither had ever known. Tafari walked with the letter pressed against his chest, his feet tracing streets he had wandered for years without purpose. But today, his steps had meaning. They carried pain, yes, but also something more, a fragile hope, a quiet anger, and a longing buried so deep it had almost died with him. The city, so loud and alive, blurred around him. Buildings stretched like giants above, but his eyes were fixed on one place. The tall, cold structure he had once passed without a glance, the building that had belonged to a stranger. Now no longer a stranger at all. It stood in front of him like a monument to everything he had never been allowed to touch. A life he had been denied. A world built with stone and glass, but one that had cost a man his soul. Inside, in a quiet corner office, the man stood by the window. He had watched the streets for hours waiting, not with certainty, but with fear. He knew the letter had been found. He knew the boy had read it. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't predict, was whether the child he had once abandoned would come. Then, he saw him, small, still, but walking straight toward the front steps. Tafari crossed the gleaming lobby, past polished marble, floors that had never welcomed him, past guards who did not stop him, past people who moved aside as if they could feel something in him, something heavy, something burning. He took the elevator without knowing which button to press. And yet, the doors opened exactly where they needed to. The hallway was silent. The man stood waiting, not as a wealthy figure, not as a name engraved on plaques, but as a father stripped bare. Tafari stepped into the room. The moment was thick with unspoken years, with wounds carved deep by time and silence. They looked at each other, one old, one young, both broken by choices they didn't fully understand. And yet, there was no screaming. No words at all, just silence. And in that silence, something moved. The boy who had spent his life alone had found the one who left him. And the man who had lost everything finally saw what truly mattered. Tafar, I did not run. He did not fall into the man's arms. He stood tall, holding the letter like a flame that refused to die. And in that moment, without words, a door opened, not in the building, but between two hearts that had never known how to reach each other. It would not be easy. Healing never is. But as they stood together in that office, one trembling with guilt, the other standing in quiet defiance, something new began. Not a reunion, not forgiveness, but a beginning. One built not on wealth, but on truth, because a poor black orphan had spent his last dollar on a stranger, and discovered, in return, the one thing he never knew he had: a father.